Ani bujo, Myeengun Henry deshkan zibi and onjiba, Myeengun. Like to welcome you to this segment of Nish Vibes. We're here on this day, going to have a good chat with a good friend of mine from Renison. I want to introduce you to Scott McLeod from Renison College here at the University of Waterloo. And we've had a few discussions and I really enjoy speaking to you. And I'm glad you're able to join us today. So how you doing today, Scott?
Doing pretty good, thanks. Glad to be here.
Oh, that's great. That's great. The purpose of the show is to kind of get to know people, what they do. There's so many people work at the university and do great things. And sometimes we kind of stay in our own little world and we get busy with the things that we do in our area. But to branch out a little bit and to have a discussion with people, just to get to know them a little better and to find out the type of work that you do and become friends. And I think that's really what Nish Vibes is all about. So I really appreciate you coming in today and spending a little bit of time with us to talk about you and the work that you do and your experience and whatever you feel like talking about. So that's really what the show is about. So maybe Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself and, what you do here and how you're enjoying it.
Sure. Thanks. So I'm the chaplain at Renison College, and my primary role is to support students. And so how I like to say that to students is if they need help with anything, then I'm there to try and help them. And whether that's in crisis for any reason, or if they're looking to go somewhere for the weekend and they need to figure out directions or how to access anything from car rentals to buses, I will help them with that too, and everything in between. So yeah, the primary role is to support students in any way that I can. And the founding of Renison College was through the Anglican Church, so it still maintains those connections. And so I'm an ordained Anglican priest. I worked in the church in parishes for about 17 years, and then took on this role, or they took me on, I should say. So I've been at Renison since February of 2022. And I'm really enjoying working with students. I find there's a lot of similarities to what I've been doing for all the time I've been working, and a lot of differences too. And the importance of building relationships with students to build up trust, or street cred for so many students, and considering the history of the church, the bad and the good. And there's so many students who have either no connection or understanding or relationship. So I'm just a guy. And so the importance of building those relationships so that I can offer support if and when they need it. And it's been a really, really interesting journey getting into all of that at Renison, and then connecting with the rest of the University of Waterloo too.
So I guess switching over from parishes, in a community into a school environment, was that a bit of a transition for you, or did you work with students before?
I'd had the opportunity to work a little bit with students, but I'd say it's been a transition, and largely just because in the parish environments that I've been in, multi-generational challenges and crises and everything else that people are living through, and the joys and celebrations are very broad. So moving into the college environment or the university environment, then the age group is a little more narrow, and so the focus is a little more specific or niche. And so just adjusting to that and trying to remember what life was like for me, 18, 19, or into my early 20s, and trying to keep that front of mind and listen. I think just because of experience, I have that tendency to maybe do too much talking. And so just reminding myself how important it is to listen to the students and then take some time to think and reflect with them, and then figure out responding.
So maybe I was thinking about having somewhat of a religious affiliation at a university or college. I think it's been here for a long time. In fact, I heard the affiliated religious colleges were here quite early, in the building of the university. So I guess there's a history of people that come to university that are attached to certain religions, and maybe that would be one of the reasons that they come here, because we still have that relationship. Do you find that to be true, or is it kind of changing right now?
For Renison, at least in the Anglican world, Renison is a little unique for schools with an Anglican affiliation because Renison's never had theological programs, and there's no requirement or expectation around students who are Renison registered to have a specific religious affiliation. So I think as we've seen shifts and change in culture and society, that's reflected in the student population at Renison. So there's not a whole lot of students who necessarily specifically identify as being religious, and then even less who identify as Anglican specifically. Yeah, I think it's just reflective of the landscape, partly because of Renison's programming and the courses that it offers through the University of Waterloo. The student population is very diverse. And so what's, I think, cool and exciting is that there's a huge representation of different students. And so there's a lot of different religions and spiritualities reflected in the student population, which is, I think, really healthy and good. And it's maybe different than when the college was first founded. And it was first founded as a residence because I guess back in the 50s and 60s, there was also housing crisis for students and residence was needed. And then shortly after it grew and then started to become what it is today and started offering programming. But just as everything has changed through time, we've seen that reflected in culture and society around us. And so that is reflected at Renison. I know that some of the other colleges have different relationships. So St. Jerome's with the Roman Catholic Church and Conrad Grebel College with the Mennonite Church. So I can't speak to those situations, but just that it is different at Renison. And I think given all the conversations and work around truth and reconciliation, there's good questions being asked and work being done to look at that relationship and consider what has been, what is, and look at the future and work towards what can be. It's unique in some ways that relationship is still there, considering just post-secondary education in Canada, but there are those historical ties too.
So that's a good segue into something I wanted to talk to you about. It was the role of the Anglican Church in the residential school system. I know there is a history, there. We have a Anglican church on our First Nation community who was affiliated with the residential school that was built on our reserve years ago. We had one called Mount Elgin that existed for 100 years, and it was first by the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Anglican Church took over at some point. So I'm just wondering, in today's world and the education that you provide, has there been any research into that type of affiliation with residential schools? And is that being taught to students about, the role and maybe looking forward to what, we can improve relations and build them stronger?
Yeah. So speaking broadly and widely, a very dark chapter of the history of the Anglican Church in Canada is its participation and support of colonialism, support of the residential school, support of genocide, essentially across the board, because the people, whether knowing or not, the church as an organization was a key partner for the government in all of its work, everything through the Indian Act. So, it shares all of that terrible work that was done. Specifically at Renison, there has been, we don't have a class teaching about the Anglican Church's role in residential schools and everything else related to colonialism. There are aspects of what I do as chaplain to make sure that's being highlighted. So everything from information and displays, certainly something that in the opportunities that I have for speaking and teaching, things that I talk about, things that I encourage students and staff and faculty, anybody who will listen to me, to think about as well. But there's more work that we can be doing. There is a couple of committees at Renison that are working on better understanding the history of Renison and its relation to residential schools, to everything else related to that. So the college is named after Archbishop John Renison, and he was a priest here in Ontario and then became a bishop and then an archbishop. And so when he was archbishop, there were 3 residential schools under his purview. When he was so an archbishop is an overseer of a large area, a bishop is a overseer of a single diocese, we call it. So when he was bishop of the Diocese of Moosonee. So he was up in Moose Factory. So there's a residential school up there. And then when he was archbishop, then wider, bigger area. And so then there were 3 schools under his purview. And it's one of those situations where, in reading his own autobiography and other historical pieces, he doesn't seem to have been personally responsible for anything, but he also, in the day and age, didn't do anything to correct any of the things that were going on at the time. And so, you could say he was just a man of the time, but it's challenging because, we want to look at those leaders and say, they made positive change. They did good. And so looking at that history, is his lack of action, is that excusable? And so that's one of the questions that I think the college is wrestling with, and then the wider church. We know that he did have relationship with the James Bay Cree. We know that there are still people living in the community who remember him, but we don't know sort of the full extent or have a clear understanding of what that relationship was like. So, yeah.
That kind of brings up a good point, though, with the turns of some of the universities like Ryerson, who actually changed their name because of their affiliation with residential schools and association with our first prime minister here being a part of that process. And I know it was the Times during that time, and they probably didn't, maybe I'm not sure if they knew what was going on at those schools or not, but to be affiliated with them probably sends a uncomfortable feeling for many communities like James Bay, who probably realized there's a school named after him, and whatever his role was, as a leader over various schools. Has there been any kind of conversation with people, like from there?
So the college has reached out, and there's been some initial conversation, mm-hmm. and I haven't been a part of those conversations. The president and others have pursued that, and there, to my understanding, there hasn't been a lot of conversation back and forth, and so it's being pursued, but we're unsure whether that's sort of a interest or willingness, or trying not to make any assumptions. But there hasn't been a lot of conversation up till now, but there's definitely interest at the college to pursue the conversation and get a clearer sense, because they are wanting to consider every aspect and look at both that distance relationship and the local relationship, and what can Renison do concretely to ensure that it is making change, it's participating in truth and reconciliation. It's changing from how things were to making a better future for everybody.
That's good to hear, because, I think with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who looked at all the schools and throughout Canada, and they were named, in some of the documents, but because of the research, they're still investigating a lot of things that they found out. So looking at schools, that are affiliated with a residential school or just named after them or whatever, those conversations haven't come to light in the Indigenous community as much to identify certain schools. We know some of them were. But I think that's good to be open and free to have these conversations about, the effects of that being related to, an atrocity that way. But I'm sure Renison did some good things, as you said, too. So there must have been a reason that, they named the school that originally, probably for the good things. Maybe they weren't talking about the residential school at that time. They made that decision. But, it must be operated by a board of governors, I would imagine, your school. So they probably having those kind of conversations. And it's good to hear, at least, we'll see where it all goes.
And we're we're very lucky, I think, and glad that actually Jean Becker has joined the Board of Governors as well. So to have her voice and presence to assist with these kinds of conversations and just all of the other pieces of looking at how Renison runs and what it does.
That's good to hear. I didn't know that. So, of course, Jean is an expert, at many things. So she'll add good knowledge, to the board. And if they're having those discussions, you have a perfect person to be on that board to talk to. So
yeah,
that's good. That's good. So overall, like your role here now you haven't been here very long yet. So you're still kind of new here, but
yeah.
How is your interaction between other parts of the university going? Do you get a chance to visit and see what else is going on here?
So I'd say it's always a work in progress, and I'm not getting out maybe as much as I would like to, but slowly but surely. And so I've appreciated the opportunity to come and meet with you, and connected a bit with Whisk because they're just next door at United College, and connected with folks at St. Jerome's and other people at United College and also at Grable. Started to connect to other parts of the university. There's a former chaplain who had started doing some work with grad students. So I've been able to meet some people in engineering and math and physics. And then through some projects that we've been working on at Renison, just around food security, we've been able or I've been able to connect and meet some people through WUSA and look at how to collaboratively work on some of those food security issues, and in trying to create opportunities for students to have conversation. Had the opportunity to connect with one of the counselors through counseling to host a conversation safe space for queer students. That was after one of those terrible incidents last year. And so, really valuing the opportunities to connect in with different groups around campus and start to make those connections.
Good to hear, because I was wondering, do you hold Anglican services? And how often does that happen?
Yeah, we do. So there is a chapel at Renison, and we have an Anglican service every Monday evening at 6 p.m. And then besides the chapel, we have relatively newly developed, we're calling it a multi-faith prayer space, but so a place where people for whom going into the chapel could be problematic or difficult or not possible. So we have a dedicated space that's not the chapel for people to go and use, and looking at ways of improving and adding to that space and trying to make it more welcoming and accessible for students from all different backgrounds and faiths. But specifically the Anglican, we do have a chapel, do regular services. And
that's good to hear. I'm wondering, because of the rejuvenation of Indigenous, spiritual practices, there's a conversation about smudging and, drumming and things like that at the university. We do have policies, and I think that was born before we actually got started with the initiatives here. I was at another institution where I wasn't very fond of building policies on smudging. I just thought maybe if we taught people to do that respectfully, and we know there's people with, lung issues and other issues that can't, be around that. But I think if you do it in a respectful manner and not have a huge, smudge that's, causing problems, it's not too much of a problem. So the university is looking at the possibility, they're testing areas where we can actually do that well, and also have a system to do that. Have you got a chance to look at smudging policies at Renison at all, or?
So in my time, I've been able to look at them, and hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn, but I mean, so part of my tradition and the Anglican tradition is the use of incense. Mm-hmm. And just for me personally, it's really important, and needs to be, as you were talking about smudging, needs to be done properly, needs to be done respectfully, needs to consider people with breathing and lung issues, but it's an important part of the tradition. And so thanks to that teaching I've had from my own tradition, and I can 100% understand and appreciate the importance of smudging. And I would like to see us have a policy that allows for First Nation students and staff and faculty to be able to engage in the practices that are life-giving, that are important and necessary. And the fact that I know that I could go and use incense in the chapel at any time, I would like to see the same be offered to First Nations students, staff, and faculty as far as smudging. So the policies at Renison are in line with the university. If I'm pushing the envelope, I'm going to say that that's maybe a baseline, but we can do better. And so slowly but surely, I would like to work with people and see us do more and offer more there. So it's okay at the moment, in the same way that the policies at Waterloo broadly are okay. But again, I think we can do a lot better. And I think it's really important to work towards that.
Well, that's good. I'm glad we're, having conversations about that, because it's important for an Indigenous student under stress or going through some life challenges sometimes, just to have a place where you can practice that ceremony and to know that you're safe in doing that. And I think that's a good example. We can improve everywhere. The university policies can improve, and I think over time we'll see more Indigenous students here, who are going to be wanting to practice those ceremonies. I've had conversations with the university level here about this generation of students and Indigenous students who are now coming to terms with what took place, in their families due to residential school victimizations and things like that. So I think you were at one of our recent recommitment ceremonies that we had. And one of the questions I posed to the president here was sustainability, like how beyond your term as a president is this still going to continue? But I also talked to him about the generation of students who now are waking up to the reasons why there was alcohol in their families and incarceration and poverty, for the most part, and feeling very angry about that. You can have a student come in who's got that anger in their heart, especially from their new learning, because we're having Indigenous studies courses now. How do we handle those? Like, if, we don't want to see any incidents here anymore, like what we had over the summer, but we do have to take in consideration what drives that anger sometimes. So I was hoping we would get something in place, to deal with those types of issues, because it's going to happen more. People that were raised in urban settings that weren't really affiliated with their First Nation are finding out why there's problems that going on. And first thing that comes out is anger. So I think this is something we can strategically work on, with all the colleges and university here, to not just say a person's coming in to create havoc or problems, but the anger comes from someplace where we have to deal with it. Because if you expel a student, that doesn't support that student, and probably even makes them worse sometimes because they're acting out in what they've come to know. So, that's a conversation I know, maybe boards can have or faculty can have, and yourself, about at least knowing that could happen and how we're going to deal with that. So I'm sure we haven't ran into that, very much right, so far, but, something to consider for sure. At least there's conversations now and things going on. So more personally, is it like, are you on contract here, or are you a permanent staff, or how does that work for a position like yours?
So the chaplain position at Renison is a permanent position. So I'm here, and I hope to be here for as long as I'm useful and able to provide support to students and do the work of supporting students that's expected of me.
So do you have like a drop-in or times slotted for, meeting with students, or is it basically?
I try to post my office hours every week so that students can drop in, and I try to make myself as available as possible. The times seem to shift and change every week depending on meetings and other things. So the importance of posting them so that students know when they can drop in. And if I'm being honest, I will be as flexible as possible. So if somebody comes looking for me, and that's regardless of whether they're from Renison or anywhere else on campus, I will always try to make time to see them, either right when they're there or as soon as I possibly can. Mm-hmm. So,
that's good, because like I said, there was Anglican church on the First Nations, and I'm going to bring up something that's not very comfortable a little bit, but the one on our reserve got burned down, and there was kind of like a pattern of that happening on First Nation communities over the last couple of years. we had an old school or an old church there, and, probably about 15 band members, regularly attended that church. They were pretty upset, when that happened. But I think it was the act of overall, churches on First Nation and affiliation with residential schools and molestation that took place, in some of these schools, and that one in particular. And so it was hard, for the people who turn to the Anglican Church, that go there and been there for a long time. And then the people who looked at it from a different perspective. And I that's what I'm seeing. Like the violence part of that is creeping up, when it comes to these churches on reserves. They're good people. I know. I went to that church and I spoke with the ministers and people that were running that school. But the balance of that is those ones who didn't see it that way, they might have seen it from a more angry perspective. It's what we're working through now. And I know the church has saved many families. They've attended churches and they've gone to live good lives, by having that. My grandfather in particular, he went to a Church of Jesus Christ church, and he was an angry person until he found the church. And I think it added probably good 15, 20 years to his life. And I was probably able to know him during that period, which I probably wouldn't have known him if he didn't, start going to church. So I think it's really important, that we consider what the role is in the communities and how important it is. Recently, we've seen the Pope, come and do an apology. We actually had a gathering during that time. It wasn't at Renison, it was at Grable.
St. Jerome.
No, St. Jerome, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
We had people come to witness that apology from, the Roman Catholic Church. And it was important for people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, to hear that. He went to a few different First Nations. He went up to Inuit country up there. And we had both perspectives, people that were angry that he did come and people who were so happy that he did. So I guess, were you watching closely during that time of the Pope's visit here? And did Renison or the Anglican Church have any participation in that at all?
So I definitely was watching to see what had happened. That was a long time coming, and that ask was made a long time ago. So for the Anglican part, and there's a couple different parts to this. So the Anglican Church, we operate slightly differently than the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church, everything is connected back to Rome and to the Pope. That doesn't matter whether you're in the Philippines or Canada or Europe or wherever. For the Anglican Church, it's more decentralized. And so for the Anglican Church of Canada, we have an archbishop who's the archbishop of the country, but they're not like the archbishop of the country can't go into an individual diocese and say, this person's going here, this is going to happen. The authority for that rests with only the bishop of the diocese. Whereas my perhaps crude understanding is that if the Pope so desired, the Pope could go to any part of the Roman Catholic Church and say, this is what's happening, and that's how it works. So we do have this more decentralized model. In, I believe it was 1988, the Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Canada, we call the position the primate, had offered an apology for the Anglican Church's role in residential schools. And then there was another apology offered later as well. And so one of the big questions that faces the Anglican Church is, okay, so that apology was made in 1988, and where are things today? And so I think one of the big challenges, and tying this back to the anger, is the church moves slow, and too slow for its own good sometimes, or too often. And so that's one of the challenges, is it has taken us from 1988 until where we are. And there are good things that have happened. There's definitely work that's been done. And there are Anglicans, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who are committed to seeing the church carry on its work and being accountable, being responsible for everything that it participated in as far as colonialism, residential schools, and everything else. But it's painfully slow, and it has to be the work of the people. It's not the work of the bishops. I mean, the bishops are the leaders, but everybody has to participate. And if I can share a quick anecdotal story, which
course.
I think I shared with you in one of our conversations. I sort of hold up as example a bishop I had the good fortune of knowing. So I grew up in BC on Vancouver Island, and I went to seminary in Vancouver. And so this bishop, his name was James Cruikshank, and he had been the bishop of diocese that's now doesn't operate anymore. Anyway, at the time it was the Diocese of Caribou. And early on in the first processes around litigation for residential schools, the Diocese of Caribou operated a residential school called St. George's in Lytton. And that was one of those ones that was notorious. Pretty terrible things happened. And so what Bishop Jim did was he traveled around the whole diocese and talked to everybody. Now, numerically, not a huge diocese, geographically pretty widespread area in the middle of BC. But he talked to all of the people, laid out how he saw things, and told them what he thought the stakes were. And when he had finished going around and talking to everybody, he had, I say convinced, but I'm not even sure that's the right word, but he had worked with them to come to the decision that if they needed to sell their church buildings, all of them within that diocese, so that they could start the process of truth and reconciliation, so that they could pay what was being asked, they were ready to do it. And then, maybe speaking out of turn, but then, lawyers and other people got involved, and then it didn't happen. But there was a moment, and people understood, and I'm sure there was varying different opinions, but as a group, they had come to an understanding of what their responsibility was and how they could be accountable. And they were ready to do it.
Wow.
And I wish that was across the board. And I am sad to say it's not, but I hold that up as like, that's, that should be the baseline. That should be the litmus test, because there's this understanding, and it's at odds with social cultural norms within the church, I guess. But the teaching is, the church is the people and not the buildings. So to make steps, it should be something that we consider.
Well, that kind of brings up another part of this too. Even the land, that churches are on, we're recognizing land, acknowledgements now. And I noticed on the website, you have a big land acknowledgement, and that's interesting, that they were willing to do that. The legalities, of course, always steps in and complicates things for sure. But I think the gesture of that, is really good and shows you the commitment level, that they're interested in. So, this world will assume a way, but I don't think until we take responsibility for the past, that's the part that holds First Nations back. Because if we don't, then we know there's something missing in their intent, and I think this is why we have to start, at least as hard as it is, to acknowledge our roles in residential schools and the abuses that took place there. We need to find a road of peace amongst our people to move forward. And that's in our prophecies too. We knew we had a seventh fire prophecy that talked about newcomers coming to the land, and with the intent, some good, a lot of bad when it comes to resources and land acquisitions, and where that leaves First Nation people. So we know now that in our prophecies, it was to come true, but going forward meant really reconciliation, how we deal with these things together and move forward, so that's where I think we're at right now. The truth part is the hurtful part. And this is the stories that are coming out at residential schools. And, that's going to take some time to get through. Reconciliation is it's a hope and a result of all of it, but that's going to take a while yet. But, we can do actions like, what we did here at the university. We've made it a priority now to bring Indigenous people here free of charge, from a certain First Nation communities that are in the region. And by enacting, like Jean Becker's role here as the Indigenous Relations Office, that offers services and support to the university, for things that we do here. We have a curriculum team now who's trying to implement wherever they can Indigenous knowledge and in all aspects of the university. So I think we took a big step forward here at the university with the leadership we have now. Our Orange Shirt Day event was, well attended. the past repolishing of our eagle or of our commitment, had another big turnout. So, I appreciate your role in this too, from Renison, having these conversations that you are, and building that partnership there. So, like I said, it's going to take a while, for us to get through all these things. But the TRC, I think, out of the 94 calls to action, I think there's only 20 that's been achieved so far. So we got a lot of work to do still. And when I was the chief of my nation, I had conversations with prime ministers and MPs, decision makers in the country. But I think I found out that I get more traction by working with on the ground institutions, people, that just want to know things, because governments can make decisions or try to make decisions, and they take a long time too, to get anything done. But I think if we talk to just everyday people, and if there was some implementation, like even in the services that you provide, I think it gets to people even stronger. And if we live in a democracy, they can kind of support the leadership, to act on reconciliation. One of my hopes was that reconciliation would be added to the Constitution of this country, so that no matter what party gets in, it'll still be the law to act on reconciliation. My experience is that we're kind of like a roller coaster. We're popular and then we're not popular. The 215 children that they found in Kamloops really, created people wanting to know about these things. So we got in an upswing again. But now that there's other schools finding children, it's not in the news anymore. So it's kind of on a downswing again. Yeah. But we have to keep that elevated. And I think, that's what we can do together, is to build that up so it builds a playing field at a little level.
I was so fortunate to be able to attend that polishing of the ceremony, as well as the original commitment ceremony and the other large events on campus. And I really appreciated that question that you asked the president, because just personally, that's a concern, right? You don't want to see all of this work be the flavor of the week, and then there's something else that comes along later. And so I so appreciate that work, trying to make sure that it gets set in a way where it's not movable and it is just a part of the fabric, so that there is that long-term change and the continued work of decolonizing and indigenizing. And I don't want those to just be buzzwords that everybody's using. And so really appreciate what you're saying about working with people on the ground, because there has to be that work with leaders, but if the people aren't supportive and involved, then it's nice words that leaders say. And so to make it real and lived is so important. And for the church, and I'm not sure how connecting this all in yet, but one of the things that I've been excited about and proud of is that, and it's been a long, slow journey, but for the Anglican Church of Canada, we have now developing an Indigenous Anglican Church of Canada, which is led by a sacred circle. We have an Indigenous Anglican Archbishop, and self-determining, and it's happening. And so with that, it offers the hope of decolonizing Christianity, if I can put it that way. So separating Christianity from not trying to deny or move away from the past, right? Like acknowledging the past, but saying like these are the mistakes that were done. This is not really part of the core teachings and the core spirituality of Christianity. So how can we move away from those things into a better future, acknowledging what the past was? And so I think that the work of the Sacred Circle and the burgeoning and developing Indigenous Anglican Church in Canada, I hope is going to light that fire in a good way for the rest of the church to really take not slow, steady and consistent steps, so that it's not just nice words or buzzwords, but that it becomes the lived experience and reality of moving to a better way of being.
Wow, that's good. The problem I think that exists in society is many people are doing things, but nobody knows about it, right? So it's a matter of getting it broadcasted somehow to First Nation communities and to Canada in general to know that these things are happening. And that's why I like to have conversations with people, because we don't always know internally what's happening, and there's some great things that are happening that we need to, project to people. So that's why we have Nish Vibes, actually, to try to let people know what's happening out there, especially here at the university and throughout society. So I maintain my relationship with the Assembly First Nations and First Nation communities and have in-depth conversations with people about how they feel, what's going on today. And I think there's still challenges. We still linger in, the hardship of colonialism. Our role here in Canada, we just had the first premier of Manitoba, being elected as an Indigenous person. So I think now we're getting more involved, a little bit more at decision-making levels. And I think that's a good thing. We'll build up this country to act on reconciliation. And I think that's a positive step that this country is going to. I'm really proud of what you're doing here. And thank you for spending some time with us today about what you're doing here. And you're always invited to our events that we have, our powwows we have, and our cultural events. And, you're always welcome. And I'd like to come over to your service someday and, join in. And, I've been to the Mennonite services. I've been to various churches, just wanting to know more, because it's not just us people want to know about. I want to, vice versa, know about other religions and practices and things like that. So I'll take you up on a 6 o'clock on a Monday sometime and come and join you.
Awesome. Thank you for your hospitality and invitations. And please, always welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. My guest was Scott, came here from Renison today, and I want to thank our technician over here doing all the work and getting the show ready for everybody. So welcome to Nish Vibes. We'll see you again on another day. We say in our language, Mama Pi Minwa, which means see you again. Take care.